The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky terrain of Afghanistan's Kunar province, as Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez adjusted his scope one final time. 3,000 feet above the valley floor, he had been lying motionless for over 18 hours, his ghillie suit blending perfectly with the ancient stones that had witnessed countless battles throughout history. The weight of his Barrett M82 rifle felt familiar against his shoulder, like an old friend he could trust with his life. Below in the valley, a 6-man SEAL team moved through what they believed was a routine reconnaissance mission. Team leader Lieutenant Commander Jake Thompson had led his men through dozens of similar operations, but something felt different this morning. The intelligence reports had been vague, mentioning possible Taliban movement in the area, but nothing concrete enough to cancel their mission to gather information about a suspected weapons cache. Rodriguez watched through his scope as the SEALs advanced in perfect formation, their movements precise and coordinated. He had been assigned as their Overwatch sniper, a guardian angel they might never see but whose presence could mean the difference between life and death. His job was simple in theory but demanding in practice: stay hidden, stay alert, and be ready to engage any threats that might emerge. The rocky landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, dotted with caves and crevices that could hide an army. Rodriguez had chosen his position carefully, selecting a spot that gave him clear sight lines across multiple approach routes while keeping him concealed from enemy observation. His camouflage was so effective that even his own team would have difficulty spotting him from just a few hundred yards away. As the morning progressed, Rodriguez noticed subtle changes in the environment around him. Birds that had been chirping earlier had fallen silent. The wind patterns seemed different, carrying unfamiliar scents and sounds. Years of combat experience had taught him to trust these instincts, and every fiber of his being was telling him that danger was approaching. Through his radio earpiece, he could hear the quiet communications between the SEAL team members as they methodically searched the area below. Their voices were calm and professional, but Rodriguez could detect the underlying tension that came with operating in hostile territory. Every shadow could conceal an enemy fighter. Every rock formation could hide an improvised explosive device. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and Rodriguez felt sweat beginning to form beneath his camouflaged clothing. He remained perfectly still, knowing that even the slightest movement could compromise his position and potentially endanger the lives of the men he was sworn to protect. His water supply was limited, and he had been rationing it carefully since taking his position the previous evening. As the SEALs continued their advance, Rodriguez began to notice movement in the rocks to the east of their position. At first it was almost imperceptible, just a slight shift in shadows that could have been caused by the changing angle of the sun. But his trained eye caught details that others might miss, and he began to focus his attention on that area with growing concern. The movement became more distinct, and Rodriguez realized with growing alarm that armed figures were positioning themselves in the rocks above the SEAL team's intended route. The enemy fighters were using the natural terrain to their advantage, setting up what appeared to be a carefully planned ambush. They had obviously been tracking the American forces and had moved into position during the night. Just as Rodriguez had done, Rodriguez counted at least 8 Taliban fighters, possibly more hidden in the cave systems that honeycombed the mountainside. They carried a mixture of AK-47 rifles and rocket-propelled grenades, and their positioning suggested they had significant military training. This was not a random encounter with local insurgents, but a coordinated attack by experienced fighters who had planned this ambush carefully. The SEAL team below remained unaware of the developing threat. They continued their methodical advance through the valley, following standard operating procedures that had served them well in previous missions. Rodriguez knew that within minutes they would walk directly into a killing zone, where the enemy would have every advantage. The natural amphitheater of rocks would funnel the Americans into a confined area where escape would be nearly impossible. Rodriguez felt his heart rate increase as he realized the gravity of the situation developing before him. The SEAL team was walking into a perfectly executed trap, and he might be their only hope for survival. His finger moved to his radio transmit button, but he hesitated, knowing that any radio communication could potentially be intercepted by enemy forces equipped with scanning equipment. The weight of responsibility settled heavily on his shoulders as he watched the Taliban fighters make their final preparations. Some were checking their weapons. Others were positioning ammunition where it would be easily accessible during the firefight. Their confidence was evident in their relaxed movements, and Rodriguez understood that they believed they had already won this battle before it had even begun. Time seemed to slow as Rodriguez calculated distances, wind speed, and the various factors that would affect his shots. The range to the closest enemy position was approximately 800 meters, well within his capabilities but requiring absolute precision under extreme pressure. He would have only seconds to engage multiple targets once the ambush began, and every shot would need to count if he hoped to save the lives of the men below. Rodriguez made his decision in that critical moment, knowing that seconds could mean the difference between life and death for the SEAL team below. He whispered a quick prayer under his breath, asking for steady hands and clear vision, then reached for his radio with careful, deliberate movements that would not compromise his concealed position among the rocks. Breaking radio silence was a calculated risk that could potentially alert enemy forces to his presence, but Rodriguez knew that warning the SEAL team was more important than maintaining his own cover. He pressed the transmit button and spoke in the lowest possible whisper that would still carry through the communication system. The Taliban fighters were now in their final positions, with several of them checking their watches in what appeared to be a coordinated countdown to the ambush. Rodriguez could see the team leader of the enemy group making hand signals to his men, indicating that the attack would begin within moments. The American SEAL team below continued their advance, completely unaware that death was waiting for them in the rocks above. Lieutenant Commander Thompson received Rodriguez's warning through his earpiece, just as his team was approaching a narrow section of the valley where the terrain would force them into single-file formation. The message was brief but clear. Enemy fighters positioned above them, ambush imminent, seek immediate cover. Thompson's years of combat experience kicked in instantly, and he immediately signaled his team to take defensive positions. The SEALs moved with practiced efficiency, diving behind whatever cover they could find in the rocky terrain. Their training had prepared them for exactly this type of situation, and they spread out to avoid presenting a concentrated target for the enemy fighters above. Each man found a position that would allow him to return fire while providing maximum protection from incoming rounds. Rodriguez watched through his scope as the SEAL team took cover just moments before the Taliban fighters opened fire. The enemy had lost the element of surprise that was crucial to their ambush plan, but they were still in superior positions with clear fields of fire down into the valley. The sound of automatic weapons fire echoed off the rocky walls, creating a deafening cacophony that could be heard for miles. The first exchange of gunfire was intense and chaotic, with muzzle flashes visible from multiple positions in the rocks above the SEAL team. Rodriguez could see that the enemy fighters were well positioned and determined to press their attack, despite losing the element of surprise. They had superior numbers and better terrain, advantages that could still prove decisive in the coming battle. Rodriguez began engaging the enemy fighters from his concealed position, carefully selecting targets that posed the greatest immediate threat to the SEAL team below. His first shot took down the Taliban leader who had been coordinating the ambush, sending the man tumbling down the rocky slope. The .50 caliber round from his Barrett rifle was devastating at this range, and the other enemy fighters immediately began looking around wildly, trying to locate the source of the sniper fire. The psychological effect of Rodriguez's intervention was immediate and significant. The Taliban fighters had planned their ambush assuming they would face only the 6 SEAL team members in the valley below. The sudden appearance of accurate sniper fire from an unknown location introduced an element of uncertainty and fear that disrupted their carefully coordinated attack plan. Rodriguez continued engaging targets methodically, prioritizing those fighters who were carrying rocket-propelled grenades that could devastate the SEAL team's positions. Each shot was carefully aimed and precisely executed, with Rodriguez taking into account factors such as wind speed, target movement, and the ballistic characteristics of his ammunition at this extreme range. The SEAL team below was returning fire with everything they had, but their position in the valley floor put them at a significant disadvantage against enemies who held the high ground. They were essentially trapped in a natural bowl surrounded by rocky outcroppings that provided excellent cover for the attacking Taliban fighters. Without Rodriguez's intervention from above, their situation would have been nearly hopeless. As the firefight continued, Rodriguez noticed additional enemy fighters moving through the cave systems in the mountainside, apparently reinforcements that had been positioned as reserves for the ambush. The Taliban had planned this operation with military precision, anticipating that the American forces might call for backup and positioning additional fighters to counter any relief efforts. The radio communications between the SEAL team members were tense but professional as they coordinated their defensive fire and attempted to identify escape routes from their precarious position. Lieutenant Commander Thompson was working to establish communication with their base to request immediate evacuation support. But the rocky terrain was interfering with their radio signals. Rodriguez realized that his ammunition supply was not unlimited, and he needed to make every shot count as the battle continued to intensify. He had brought enough rounds for a typical Overwatch mission, but this extended firefight was consuming his ammunition at a rate he had not anticipated. Each remaining cartridge in his possession could potentially save the life of one of the men fighting for survival in the valley below. The Taliban fighters were beginning to adapt to the presence of the sniper, moving more cautiously and using smoke grenades to obscure their positions. They were clearly experienced fighters who understood modern battlefield tactics and were adjusting their strategy to account for the unexpected threat from above. This tactical flexibility made them more dangerous and prolonged the engagement significantly. Rodriguez could see muzzle flashes from positions he had not previously identified, indicating that more enemy fighters were joining the battle from concealed positions throughout the rocky landscape. The situation was becoming increasingly desperate for the outnumbered SEAL team, and Rodriguez knew that his continued intervention was becoming more critical with each passing minute. The battle had been raging for nearly 40 minutes when Rodriguez noticed a disturbing development in the enemy's tactics. The Taliban fighters were beginning to coordinate their movements more effectively, using hand signals and what appeared to be a sophisticated communication system to outflank the trapped SEAL team. Several groups of fighters were moving through the cave networks to position themselves for a final assault from multiple directions. Simultaneously, Rodriguez adjusted his position slightly to get a better angle on the new threats, knowing that even this small movement could potentially reveal his location to enemy spotters. The ghillie suit that had kept him hidden for so long was becoming a burden in the intense heat. But he dared not remove any part of his camouflage while enemy fighters were actively searching for his position. Through his scope, Rodriguez could see that the SEAL team was running low on ammunition after the prolonged firefight. The men were conserving their rounds, taking more careful shots and communicating constantly about their remaining supplies. Lieutenant Commander Thompson was making difficult decisions about resource allocation, knowing that they needed to make their ammunition last until relief forces could reach their position. The rocky terrain that had initially provided some protection for the SEAL team was now working against them as enemy. Fighters used the same features to advance closer to their positions. Rodriguez watched in growing concern as Taliban fighters moved from rock to rock, getting closer with each bound while maintaining effective suppressive fire on the Americans below. Rodriguez's ammunition situation was also becoming critical. He had started the mission with 40 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, which should have been more than sufficient for a standard Overwatch operation. However, the intensity and duration of this firefight had consumed most of his supply, and he was down to his final 8 rounds. Each shot would need to be perfect, targeting only the most dangerous threats to the SEAL team's survival. New element entered the battle when Rodriguez spotted what appeared to be a Taliban sniper taking position in the rocks, approximately 600 meters to his east. The enemy marksman was carrying a Dragunov rifle and appeared to be searching for targets among the SEAL team positions. This represented a significant escalation in the threat level, as an accurate enemy sniper could systematically eliminate the trapped Americans one by one. Rodriguez immediately shifted his attention to this new threat, understanding that eliminating the enemy sniper was now his highest priority. The Taliban marksman was well positioned and clearly experienced, taking his time to find the perfect shot rather than rushing into action. Rodriguez could see through his scope that the enemy sniper was methodically scanning the SEAL team's positions through his own optical sight. The wind had picked up significantly since the morning, adding another variable that Rodriguez needed to calculate for his long-range shots. At distances exceeding 800 meters, even small changes in wind speed and direction could cause a precision shot to miss its intended target completely. Rodriguez took several deep breaths and observed the movement of dust and debris, to gauge the wind conditions accurately. Rodriguez lined up his shot on the enemy sniper, knowing that this could be the most important shot of his military career. The Taliban marksman was partially concealed behind a rock formation, with only his head and shoulders visible through Rodriguez's scope. The target was relatively small at this distance, requiring absolute precision and perfect timing to ensure a successful engagement. Just as Rodriguez was preparing to take the shot, the enemy sniper fired his rifle toward the SEAL team positions below. Rodriguez saw one of the American fighters stumble and go down, apparently hit by the enemy's accurate fire. The wounded SEAL was quickly dragged to cover by his teammates, but Rodriguez could see that the injury was serious and would further compromise the team's fighting effectiveness. Rodriguez squeezed his trigger with the steady pressure that had been drilled into him through thousands of hours of training. The .50 caliber round crossed the distance to its target in less than 2 seconds, and Rodriguez watched through his scope as the enemy sniper was eliminated with a single precise shot. The Taliban marksman's rifle fell silent, eliminating one of the most dangerous threats to the SEAL team's survival. The elimination of their sniper seemed to demoralize the Taliban fighters, who had been counting on the marksman's accurate fire to pin down the American forces while they maneuvered for a final assault. Rodriguez could see enemy fighters looking around nervously, clearly concerned about the presence of an American sniper, whose position they had been unable to locate despite intensive searching. Rodriguez now had only 6 rounds remaining, and the situation below was becoming increasingly desperate. The SEAL team was still pinned down by superior numbers, and the wounded team member required immediate medical attention that could not be provided in their current tactical situation. Lieutenant Commander Thompson was attempting to coordinate an extraction plan, but the enemy's positions made any movement extremely dangerous. The Taliban fighters renewed their assault with increased intensity, apparently deciding to overwhelm the American positions through sheer firepower, rather than trying to locate and eliminate the hidden sniper. Rodriguez could see fighters emerging from previously concealed positions, indicating that the enemy commander had committed his reserves to this final push against the trapped SEAL team. Rodriguez realized that his remaining ammunition would not be sufficient to stop the coordinated assault that was developing. He needed to make each shot count for maximum effect, targeting key leaders and fighters carrying heavy weapons that posed the greatest threat to the Americans below. The mathematics of the situation were stark. 6 bullets to stop what appeared to be more than 20 enemy fighters advancing on the SEAL team's positions. The sound of approaching helicopters could be heard in the distance, indicating that relief forces were finally en route to the battle scene. However, Rodriguez could see that the helicopters were still several minutes away, and the Taliban fighters were preparing to overrun the SEAL team's positions before the aircraft could arrive to provide support. The sound of helicopter rotors grew louder, but Rodriguez knew that the rescue aircraft were still too far away to prevent the final Taliban assault that was now beginning. Through his scope, he could see enemy fighters rising from their concealed positions and beginning to advance on the SEAL team's location in a coordinated rush. This was the moment the Taliban commander had been waiting for, committing all his remaining forces to overwhelm the Americans before help could arrive. Rodriguez made rapid calculations in his mind, identifying the 6 most critical targets among the advancing enemy fighters. He focused on those carrying rocket-propelled grenades and automatic weapons, knowing that eliminating these threats would give the SEAL team the best chance of surviving the next few crucial minutes. His hands were steady despite the enormous pressure, years of training taking over as he prepared for the most important shots of his career. My first shot took down a Taliban fighter who was carrying an RPG launcher and preparing to fire it at the largest concentration of SEAL team members. The .50 caliber round eliminated the threat instantly, and the rocket-propelled grenade exploded harmlessly against the rocks where it had fallen. Rodriguez immediately shifted to his next target without taking time to confirm the results of his first shot. The second round eliminated another RPG gunner who had been moving to flank the SEAL team's position from the east. Rodriguez could see through his scope that his accurate fire was beginning to disrupt the Taliban assault, with fighters diving for cover and looking around frantically for the source of the devastating sniper fire. The psychological impact was as important as the physical elimination of key threats. Rodriguez's third shot targeted the Taliban assault leader, a bearded fighter who had been using hand signals to coordinate the advance of his men. The elimination of this key figure caused immediate confusion among the attacking fighters, with several groups stopping their advance and looking to others for leadership. This hesitation gave the SEAL team precious seconds to adjust their defensive positions and prepare for the continued assault. The fourth round was used to eliminate a machine gunner who had been providing suppressive fire that was keeping the SEAL team pinned down in their rocky defensive positions. With this threat removed, the Americans were able to shift their positions and bring more effective fire to bear on the remaining Taliban fighters. Rodriguez could see Lieutenant Commander Thompson repositioning his men to take advantage of the tactical opportunity. Rodriguez now had only 2 rounds remaining in his rifle, and there were still more than a dozen enemy fighters continuing their assault on the SEAL team's positions. He needed to make these final shots count for maximum tactical effect, selecting targets whose elimination would have the greatest impact on the overall battle situation. The pressure was enormous, knowing that the lives of 6 fellow Americans depended on his marksmanship skills. The 5th shot eliminated a Taliban fighter who had been carrying a belt-fed machine gun and was setting up a position that would have allowed him to rake the SEAL team's defensive line with devastating automatic fire. Rodriguez watched through his scope as the heavy weapon tumbled down the rocky slope, removing another critical threat from the battlefield just as the enemy fighter had been preparing to open fire. Rodriguez chambered his final round, knowing that this last shot needed to have maximum psychological impact on the remaining Taliban fighters. He selected a target who appeared to be assuming command of the assault after the elimination of the previous leader. This fighter was positioned prominently and was actively directing other fighters toward the American positions using obvious hand signals. The final shot was perfect, eliminating the new Taliban leader just as he was pointing toward the SEAL team's position and preparing to order a final rush. The sudden loss of another commander caused panic among the remaining enemy fighters, who began retreating toward their original positions in the rocky caves above the valley floor. The coordinated assault had collapsed just minutes before the rescue helicopters arrived on station. The distinctive sound of Apache attack helicopters filled the air as the relief force finally reached the battle area. Rodriguez could see the aircraft approaching fast and low, their weapons systems already targeting the retreating Taliban fighters who were trying to escape back into the cave systems. The cavalry had arrived just in time to prevent what could have been a massacre of the trapped SEAL team. Rodriguez remained in his concealed position as the Apache helicopters engaged the fleeing enemy fighters with devastating precision. The rocky landscape that had provided concealment for the Taliban ambush now became a trap, with the aircraft's thermal imaging systems easily tracking the heated signatures of running men against the cooler background of ancient stone. The rescue helicopters landed in the valley below, and Rodriguez watched through his scope as the SEAL team members rushed their wounded comrade to the waiting medical evacuation aircraft. The injured man was conscious and moving under his own power with assistance, indicating that his wounds were serious but not life-threatening. The sight of his fellow Americans being safely evacuated filled Rodriguez with a profound sense of relief and accomplishment. Lieutenant Commander Thompson took a moment before boarding the evacuation helicopter to scan the rocky hillsides with his binoculars, searching for any sign of the sniper who had saved his team's lives. Rodriguez remained perfectly still in his camouflaged position, knowing that revealing himself now could compromise future operations and put other American forces at risk. The SEAL team leader raised his hand in a salute toward the general area, where he suspected his guardian angel might be concealed. As the helicopters departed with their precious cargo of rescued Americans, Rodriguez finally allowed himself to relax slightly after more than 24 hours of continuous vigilance and combat stress. The immediate danger had passed, but he would need to remain in position until darkness fell, and he could safely extract from his overwatch location without being detected by any remaining enemy forces in the area. The valley below fell silent except for the distant sound of the departing helicopters, carrying the rescued SEAL team to safety. Rodriguez remained motionless in his rocky concealment, knowing that Taliban fighters might still be present in the area and could be searching for the sniper who had disrupted their carefully planned ambush. The afternoon sun was beginning to cast longer shadows across the mountainside, providing additional concealment but also making it more difficult to observe potential threats. Rodriguez began the careful process of planning his extraction from the overwatch position he had occupied for more than 24 hours. His water supply was nearly exhausted, and his body was cramping from the prolonged period of remaining motionless in the rocky terrain. However, his primary concern was avoiding detection by any remaining enemy forces who might be waiting to ambush him during his withdrawal from the area. Through his scope, Rodriguez conducted a systematic scan of the surrounding terrain, looking for any signs of enemy movement or surveillance. The Taliban fighters who had survived the helicopter attack would likely be regrouping somewhere in the extensive cave systems that honeycombed the mountainside. They would be angry about their failed ambush and eager for revenge against the American sniper, who had turned their victory into a devastating defeat. Rodriguez noticed movement in the shadows of a cave. Entrance approximately 1,000 meters to his northeast. The figures were partially concealed, but he could make out what appeared to be several Taliban fighters observing the valley where the firefight had taken place. They were probably conducting their own assessment of the battle, damage, and trying to determine what had gone wrong with their ambush plan. The presence of enemy observers complicated Rodriguez's extraction significantly. Any movement on his part could potentially be detected by the watching Taliban fighters, who would certainly be motivated to track down and eliminate the sniper who had caused so much damage to their forces. Rodriguez would need to wait for complete darkness before attempting to move from his current position. As the hours passed, Rodriguez reflected on the engagement that had just concluded. The Taliban fighters had demonstrated sophisticated planning and coordination, indicating that they were well trained and experienced in conducting ambush operations against American forces. Their choice of terrain had been nearly perfect, and they had positioned adequate reserves to deal with potential rescue attempts. Only the presence of an undetected Overwatch sniper had prevented them from achieving a devastating victory. Rodriguez realized that his intervention had saved not only the lives of 6 SEAL team members but had also prevented a significant propaganda victory for the Taliban forces operating in the region. The successful ambush of an elite American Special Operations team would have been broadcast throughout the insurgent networks and used to recruit additional fighters to their cause. Instead, they had suffered a humiliating defeat that would damage their reputation and effectiveness. The sun continued its descent toward the western horizon, and Rodriguez began making final preparations for his nighttime extraction. He would need to move carefully through terrain that might be under enemy observation, carrying his heavy rifle and equipment while avoiding detection. The route back to his extraction point was approximately 5 kilometers through rocky mountain terrain that would be treacherous to navigate in complete darkness. Rodriguez had memorized the terrain features during his approach to the Overwatch position, but moving through the area at night would present completely different challenges. The same rocks and crevices that had provided concealment during the day could become deadly obstacles in the darkness. He would need to rely on his night vision equipment and years of training in nocturnal movement techniques. As darkness finally began to fall across the mountainside, Rodriguez heard the distant sound of additional aircraft in the area. The sound signature suggested they were surveillance drones, probably conducting reconnaissance to assess the results of the day's engagement and search for any remaining Taliban forces in the vicinity. The presence of these aircraft would provide additional security for his extraction, but also meant that his movements might be observed by friendly forces. Rodriguez began the slow process of packing his equipment and preparing to abandon his Overwatch position. Every item needed to be secured properly to prevent noise during movement, and he needed to ensure that nothing was left behind that could provide intelligence to enemy forces who might discover his position after his departure. The empty ammunition casings from his rifle were collected and secured in his pack, eliminating potential evidence of his presence. The ghillie suit that had provided such effective camouflage during the daylight hours would be less useful during nighttime movement, but could not be abandoned due to its intelligence value. Rodriguez carefully folded the specialized camouflage garment and secured it in his pack, knowing that its loss could compromise future operations by revealing American camouflage techniques to enemy forces. Rodriguez took one final look through his night vision scope at the terrain he would need to traverse during his extraction. The route he had planned would take him along a ridgeline that offered good concealment, but required crossing several open areas where he would be vulnerable to detection. The timing of his movement would be critical, taking advantage of cloud cover and other natural concealment opportunities. Before beginning his movement, Rodriguez whispered a brief prayer of gratitude for the successful outcome of the mission and for the lives that had been saved through his intervention. The weight of responsibility he had felt throughout the engagement was beginning to lift, replaced by a quiet satisfaction that comes from a job well done under the most demanding circumstances possible. Rodriguez slowly rose from the rocky position he had occupied for so many hours, his muscles protesting after the prolonged period of immobility. Every movement was deliberate and controlled, designed to minimize noise and avoid silhouetting himself against the night sky. The extraction phase of his mission was beginning, and it would require all of his remaining strength and skill to reach safety without detection by enemy forces who might still be searching for him. Rodriguez moved through the darkness like a ghost, each step carefully placed to avoid loose rocks that could betray his position to any enemy forces that might still be operating in the area. The night vision goggles provided adequate visibility for navigation, but the rocky terrain remained treacherous and demanded constant attention to foot placement and route selection. Every shadow could conceal a Taliban fighter waiting in ambush. 3 hours into his extraction movement, Rodriguez reached a predetermined checkpoint where he was scheduled to make radio contact with his support team. The communication would be brief and coded, designed to confirm his status without revealing his exact location to any enemy forces that might be monitoring radio frequencies. The response from his base confirmed that the extraction helicopter was standing by and ready to move to the pickup location. Rodriguez continued his careful movement through the mountainous terrain, following a route that avoided known Taliban strongholds and areas where enemy forces were likely to establish observation posts. His progress was necessarily slow, as any attempt to move quickly could result in a fall that would injure him or create noise that could attract unwanted attention from hostile forces still operating in the region. The extraction point was located in a small clearing approximately 2 kilometers from Rodriguez's overwatch position, far enough away to avoid association with the day's engagement, but close enough to reach during a single night's movement. The location had been carefully selected to provide adequate space for helicopter operations while offering concealment from enemy observation and defensive positions in case of contact. During the extraction process, as Rodriguez approached the final kilometer to his extraction point, he noticed lights moving in the valley below his position. The pattern and movement suggested vehicle headlights, probably Taliban fighters using trucks to search for the American sniper who had disrupted their ambush operation. The enemy forces were clearly taking the matter seriously and had committed significant resources to finding and eliminating the threat. Rodriguez adjusted his route to avoid the areas where the searching vehicles were operating, adding an additional 30 minutes to his movement time, but ensuring that he would not be detected during the final phase of his extraction. The sight of the enemy search operation reinforced the importance of maintaining absolute stealth during his movement to the pickup location. The extraction helicopter arrived precisely on schedule, approaching the landing zone with lights off and using night vision systems for navigation. The aircraft crew had been briefed on the tactical situation and understood the need for a rapid pickup to minimize exposure to potential enemy forces in the area. Rodriguez could hear the distinctive sound of the rotor blades as the helicopter approached his position. Rodriguez activated his infrared beacon to mark his exact location for the helicopter crew, using a device that was invisible to enemy forces, but clearly visible to the aircraft's night vision systems. The pilot acknowledged the signal and began his approach to the small clearing, with door gunners ready to provide covering fire if enemy forces attempted to interfere with the extraction operation. The helicopter touched down for less than 30 seconds, just long enough for Rodriguez to board the aircraft with his equipment, before lifting off again into the darkness. The crew chief helped secure Rodriguez's gear as the aircraft climbed rapidly away from the potentially hostile area, using evasive maneuvers to avoid any ground fire that might be directed at the departing helicopter. As the helicopter carried him away from the mountainous battlefield, Rodriguez looked back toward the area where he had spent the last 24 hours, and where 6 American lives had been saved through his intervention. The rocky terrain that had been his home and battlefield faded into the darkness below, but the memory of the successful mission would remain with him for the rest of his life. During the flight back to base, Rodriguez received a radio message informing him that all 6 members of the rescued SEAL team had reached safety without further incident. The wounded team member was receiving medical treatment and was expected to make a full recovery from his injuries. The successful extraction of the entire team represented a complete tactical victory, despite the enemy's initial advantages. Back at the forward operating base, Rodriguez was debriefed by intelligence officers who wanted to gather detailed information about the enemy tactics and capabilities that had been observed during the engagement. His observations about the Taliban fighters' coordination, equipment, and training would be valuable for planning future operations and protecting other American forces operating in the region. Rodriguez learned that the SEAL team had been searching for a high-value target who was believed to be coordinating Taliban operations throughout the province. The intelligence that led to their mission had been accurate, but enemy forces had detected their approach and set up the ambush that had nearly resulted in disaster. The target had escaped during the confusion of the firefight, but the disruption of the Taliban network was considered a significant operational success. Lieutenant Commander Thompson visited Rodriguez personally to express his gratitude for the intervention that had saved his team. The SEAL officer presented Rodriguez with a unit coin and a handwritten note signed by all 6 team members, expressing their appreciation for his life-saving actions during their darkest hour. The gesture meant more to Rodriguez than any official commendation or medal. Rodriguez returned to his quarters as the sun was rising over the forward operating base, completing a cycle that had begun more than 30 hours earlier, when he had first taken his overwatch position in the Rocky Mountains. His successful mission had demonstrated the critical importance of overwatch snipers in protecting American forces operating in hostile territory and had undoubtedly prevented a tragic loss of life. The after-action reports would record the engagement as a successful defensive action that had resulted in significant enemy casualties while preserving American lives. However, Rodriguez understood that the real measure of success was much simpler. 6 American warriors had gone home to their families instead of being carried home in flag-draped coffins. In the end, that was all that really mattered to the soldier who had answered their desperate prayer for protection from his rocky perch, high above the valley of death.